Welcome to this trip through one of the scariest cases in Appalachian history. In the comments, let me know where you are watching this video before we start. Today we're going to talk about things that happened in the Tennessee mountains at the beginning of the 20th century, when people were still having trouble getting to the deepest, most remote valleys in that area. People who traveled made this story possible. It's about two brothers who lived in the shade of big trees, out of sight of the law. Made the fatal mistake of crossing in front of them. The year was 1911. East Tennessee's thick forests and winding paths still held secrets. The Appalachians were a natural wall between the present and the past. They made isolated areas where the rules of society didn't seem to apply. Back then, traveling through these lands meant going into areas where help might not come for days, and where a call for help would be lost in the old oaks and pines. The roads were only slightly widened. Trails that go up and down steep hills and through deep valleys. Snow covered everything in a white blanket that hid tracks and blocked out sounds in the winter. In the summer, the air was heavy with humidity, and the plants got so thick that even during the middle of the day, light barely reached the forest floor. People could disappear there and no one would ever know about it. Stories were lost there before they could be told. In County Tennessee, one of the most remote parts of the state, there is a property that, in the middle of a valley with mountains all around, the cabin was simple. It was made of dark logs and had a roof made of worn-out planks. It had smoke coming out of its chimney all the time, even on the hottest days, making it look like something was always on fire inside. The closest neighbors lived many miles away, and those few people didn't even talk about the place or the two men who lived there. The brothers had moved to the area a few years before. They came from somewhere that no one knew for sure. They didn't talk about the past, did not go to the local church or community meetings in towns nearby. They stayed away from each other and only showed up sometimes to buy basic supplies in Newport, the closest town, which is quite far away and has rough roads. When they did show up, they behaved in a way that made people feel upset. They didn't say much but watched everyone around them very carefully and always seemed to be judging those around them very strongly. They were twins and couldn't have been told apart at all. At first glance, same height, strong build, and pale eyes that never seemed to blink enough. They always had dirt and stains on their clothes that no one wanted to name on their simple work clothes. Their beards were thick and dirty, and their hair was long and messy. They rarely smiled, and when they did, it showed that their teeth were not straight, and their face showed that they were not happy, but rather cruelly amused by dark secrets. Their property was placed near one of the few roads that go through that area on purpose. The mountains in the Appalachians. People going from Tennessee to North Carolina or Virginia often went through that area. This was especially true for people who wanted to avoid the busier and more closely watched main roads by taking shorter routes through the mountains. Travelers on a budget, adventurers, and people who wanted to stay out of trouble with the law liked making this route. The brothers had a small reputation for giving people temporary places to stay. Because the area was so unfriendly, and there weren't many places to stay, any. A place that gave them a roof over their heads and a hot meal was welcome. As far as the few travelers who reviewed the place go, the prices were fair. The cabin had a barn next to it where the horses could rest. There was always water from a nearby stream and wood for the fire. But people could feel that something was wrong with the place, even if they couldn't put their finger on it. Animals in the area stayed away from the property. There were no birds singing in the trees around the cabin. It felt like the air there was heavier, like it had an invisible weight on it. Some travelers later told people far away about a smell that was sweet and unpleasant and seemed to come from the ground itself. The smell was subtle but persistent. People first talked about it in the fall of 1898, 3 years before the events that would forever mark that spot in Tennessee's dark history. A man named Harold Messner, who sold textiles, left Knoxville for Virginia with 2 mules full of goods. He had told a few friends and acquaintances that, instead of taking 2 days to get there, he planned to take the mountain route that went through county. Harold was an experienced man who knew his way around the Appalachian trails and wasn't scared of being alone in the woods. He never got where he was going. After a few weeks, when his family started to worry about his long absence, searches were set up. Men went on the main trails, talked to locals, and checked out the few known inns and stopping places. Harold, his mules, and his goods were all missing. It looked like he had been sucked into the forest and turned into the mist that often covered that area's deep valleys. The Knoxville sheriff said it was just another case of someone going missing in the mountains, which was a sad fact of the time and place. After 6 months, in April 1899, a young woman named Catherine Wilkes went missing while traveling through the same area with her husband. The couple was coming back from visiting family in North Carolina. They chose the mountain route because someone they met at a bar. It was possible for her husband, Thomas Wilkes, to get to Newport, but he did so alone and looked very upset and confused. He told a strange story about being split up in the middle of the night because Catherine left the cabin where they were staying and never came back. Thomas wasn't able to explain what had happened well. His memories of that night were broken up and fuzzy. He remembered drinking something his hosts had given him, a strong homemade beer they said would help him fight the cool night. After that, things got fuzzy. He woke up alone in the middle of the night with a terrible headache and a bad taste in his mouth. Catherine was no longer there. The hosts, twin brothers whose names he couldn't quite remember, said she had left during the night and said something about going back to North Carolina by herself. It didn't make sense what was said. Kate didn't need to go out by herself. She didn't know the way. She didn't have enough money or food. Thomas tried to. His brothers told him not to look for her because they thought she was probably already far away and that he should go his own way. Thomas did just that because he was confused and felt incredibly weak. He realized how silly it was to have left his wife behind in that way only after some time had passed and his fog had lifted. A search was set up by the sheriff of Newport, but again, nothing was found. Thomas tried to be clear about where the cabin they had stayed was, but his directions were not clear enough. He thought of it. A trail split off near a stream. There was a steep climb, and then there was a descent into a closed valley. There were dozens of places that fit this general description. For days, police searched the area and questioned people who lived in the few homes that were out in the middle of nowhere. No one knew anything. Kate had not been seen by anyone. No one knew of 2 twin brothers who were looking for a place to stay. Thomas Wilkes never really got over what happened. He went to mediums and was tormented by guilt and doubt for the rest of his life, looking for any sign that his wife might have been hurt. 10 years later, he died in a way that some people thought was odd and others thought was suicide, but the official record said it was an accident. The story of Catherine turned into another scary mountain tale. People talked about another name around the fire on stormy nights when they told stories of travelers who never came back. Other people went missing over the next 2 years, from 1899 to 1911. One of them was a traveling preacher, 2 brothers carrying furs to sell in Knoxville, and a man running away from Kentucky debt. Even though each case was different, they all had some things in common. People who were killed were traveling alone or in small groups. All of them went through county on their own, and none of them left any significant evidence. There was a pattern that the police saw, but they didn't know what to do with it. The area was too big, and there were too many options. Things like wild animals, natural disasters, and there were thieves and other bad people in the mountains. There was no solid proof that these cases were connected to a single cause, let alone a certain place or person. Sheriffs in the counties that were affected sometimes wrote to each other and shared information, but they didn't have a lot of resources, and their areas of responsibility were too big for effective patrolling. Not until the late summer of 191 did things start to change. A lucky event revealed secrets that had been kept hidden for a long time, in a figurative sense for too long. In August 1911, it rained a lot in eastern Tennessee. Storms hit the Appalachians 3 weeks in a row with a force that older people couldn't remember ever seeing before. The banks of rivers broke, trails turned into mud rivers, and mudslides changed the shape of some mountain landscapes. It was the kind of weather that kept people inside, stopped travel, and made even the bravest people go inside to wait for things to calm down. When the rain stopped in early September, things looked different. The plants were a deeper green because they were getting more water. There were a lot of fast-moving streams. The water had washed away the ground in some places, showing what was hidden. This is exactly what took place on the property of the twin brothers, but no one knew it yet. James Rutherford, a hunter, was following the tracks of deer when he found something strange. He was way off the beaten path and had gone into a part of the forest that wasn't often visited. Tourists. It was hard to move because the ground was uneven and full of rocks and roots that were sticking out. That's when he smelled something odd in the air. It was sweet and bad, and it smelled like it was coming from everywhere at once. James was a sensible person who was used to the smells of the forest, whether they came from dead animals or plants that had gone bad, but this was different. Something very unsettling about the smell told him to stay away. Still eager to learn, and maybe even he kept going toward the source of the smell because he had a bad feeling about it. A ravine he found had not been there before, or at least it had not been seen. A natural depression in the ground was revealed after a lot of dirt and plants were washed away by the rain, and there were things in that depression that didn't belong in the forest. Some of them were hidden by branches and leaves carried by the water. First, James saw what looked like a piece of cloth. Then he saw what might have been. Worked with leather and then shapes that his brain wouldn't recognize at first. He moved slowly toward her, his heart beating fast and his breath held. When he finally got what he saw, it made his stomach hurt. It was James Rutherford who found a secret graveyard. Based on the size of the area and the number of items that were partially exposed, it wasn't just a few people who were hurt. The event in question was much bigger and had happened many times over a long period of time. James didn't do anything. He, in his mind. He wrote down where it was and what landmarks were nearby, then ran back to Newport as fast as his legs would carry him. He walked very hard for almost 3 hours to get to town. It was clear he was scared and out of breath by the time he got to the police station. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford first thought James had been robbed or chased, but what he told him was even scarier. Crawford quickly got a group of men together. Besides his 2 assistants, he called the town doctor, Dr. Samuel Hendress, and 4 other people. Men from the neighborhood who are known for being brave and discreet. No one knew for sure what they would find, but everyone knew how serious things were. By that afternoon, they were on their way to find the discovery. James led them back along the trails and into the woods. By the time they got to the ravine, it was getting dark. When Sheriff Crawford saw how bad things were, he looked at the scene with more serious eyes and his face turned darker. No one was to do it. To get too close before they could set up a proper investigation. That night, they stayed there and stood guard. The wind whispered through the trees, and the smell of the dead animals lingered in the air. The work began at dawn. Dr. Hicks was in charge of carefully looking over and making a list of what was found. Personal items from more than one person were discovered. Different types and sizes of clothes, a leather bag with initials engraved on it, pieces of a saddle, metal buttons, and a silver watch. Chain and shoe pieces. Each thing silently told a story of someone who had been there and never been seen again. The most disturbing thing that was found, though, was how the site was set up. It wasn't just a place where dead bodies were dumped. The site was ready and well organized, and it had been used many times over a long period of time. There were signs that the ground had been moved and shook up more than once. There were signs of old fires in some places, and there was a clear trail that led from that, a spot in the forest that is farther away. Crawford, the sheriff, chose to follow this trail. He moved slowly through the thick plants with half of his group. The path wound through old trees, went down a steep hill, and then came out into a small valley with walls around it. There was a dark log cabin with a barn next to it. It was partly hidden by a thicket of bushes and surrounded by tall pines. Its chimney let smoke rise slowly. Sheriff Crawford hid in the trees and watched the cabin for a long time. There was no sound or movement that could be seen, only the crackling of the fire inside and the wind rustling the leaves every once in a while. He silently told his men to spread out and surround the property with their arms raised. All of them knew how serious the situation was. If this cabin belonged to the person they thought it did, they were about to face a crime that was very different from the ones they usually dealt with. The approach was slow and thought out. Crawford moved forward with his hand on his gun holster. Through the small opening that separates the forest from the building site, both sides of his assistants stood with their weapons drawn, and all of their senses were sharp. Dr. Hricks and the other men stayed further back, ready to act if needed but away from the action. It was easy to feel the tension in the air. Each man could feel the weight of the moment. Crawford finally knocked on the heavy wooden door, and the sound echoed through the valley. Nothing was said for a moment, and then the heavy footsteps coming from inside. One of the twin brothers came out when the door slowly opened. He looked at the sheriff with those clear, uninterested eyes that didn't show surprise or worry. People seemed to think that armed visits from the police were normal and expected. Crawford introduced himself and said he was looking into missing people in the area and needed to ask some questions. The man at the door was quiet for what seemed like an eternity and then just shrugged, and flung open the door wide to welcome them in, which seemed way too casual given the situation. The sheriff thought about it for a moment and then said yes, but he kept his hand on his gun. The inside of the cabin was dark and stuffy. There was only one small window, and the fire in the stone hearth provided the only light. Inside, there was a strong smell of wood smoke, old sweat, and that sweet, unpleasant smell that was getting too familiar. There wasn't much furniture, and it was a table, some chairs that aren't level, shelves with basic supplies, and a cauldron hanging over the fire. The second brother was sitting in a corner, so far away that he was hard to see. A chill went down Crawford's spine when he saw him. They were exactly the same, and the way they both looked at the visitors with the same blank expression and relaxed posture that seemed so out of place with how tense the situation was very unsettling. It was like they were in a play whose script they didn't know. They were the only ones who knew. Crawford started his questions with care. He asked them how long they had lived there, where they were from, and if they knew anything about the travelers who had gone missing in the area. Their answers were short and vague, but not technically wrong. Yes, they did sometimes host travelers. Not at all. They couldn't remember names. They did know that the area was dangerous. There were a lot of accidents on the steep trails. There was a deep monotone in both of their voices that made it impossible to tell who was talking without looking straight at them. One of the sheriff's deputies then looked around the rest of the cabin and found something in a dark corner of the room in a wooden chest. He carefully opened the lid, and what he saw stunned him. Inside were a bunch of personal things. There are small coin purses, leather wallets, rings, brooches, and pocket watches. It was clear that each item belonged to a different person, and there were a lot of them, neatly arranged, as if they were valuable awards. The quiet, that. The only sound that broke the silence was the crackling of the fire. Not one of the brothers tried to deny or explain it. They only looked at the open chest, and then at the sheriff. Finally, one of them smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was a serious one that didn't reach his eyes. That was the moment when Crawford fully understood what he was up against. These criminals weren't just any thieves or killers. There was more wrong with this than just crime. Crawford ordered their arrest right away. To his surprise, the brothers didn't fight back. They got up without a fuss, let themselves be handcuffed, and walked out of the cabin like they were just going for a walk. They didn't ask any questions or demand explanations, and they insisted they were innocent. The fact that they didn't try to escape or get violent was more upsetting than their calm acceptance. While the brothers were being taken back to Newport, Crawford set up a full search of the property. What they found out in the next few hours proved their worst fears. In the barn, they found more things that didn't belong to them, tools that weren't used for farming or honest work, and signs of things that no one wanted to look into too closely. They dug a few feet into the dirt floor of the cabin and found more disturbing evidence buried close to the surface. The path from the cabin to the graveyard that James Rutherford found was carefully drawn on a map. It was about a mile long and went through rough terrain that didn't see many people. It was clear that the brothers knew every bend, rock, and tree along the way. They had used it many times to get their victims to their final destination, deep in the forest where they hoped no one would ever find them. Some identities were revealed by documents found in the cabin. Letters were sent to people who were on lists of missing people. There was a small ledger with dates and amounts written in code that was hard to fully understand. The watch of Harold Messner, the merchant who went missing in 1898, was found among the things that were found. It can still be read on the silver cover. Another thing that Catherine Wilkes's family would later say was hers was a brooch that she always wore. It was a wedding gift. People in Newport and nearby towns had different reactions when they heard about the arrest. Some people in the area were shocked, while others said they had always had a bad feeling about the two men, but couldn't put their finger on it. Some people also said in whispers that they had heard vague rumors. People who traveled near the property said they felt strange things, but these reports were never taken seriously enough. The twins' trial began at the Call County Courthouse in October 1911. From the first day, the small courtroom was full of people who had come from neighboring counties just to watch the proceedings. There were reporters from Knoxville, Chattanooga, and even Nashville who came to cover the case. It had never happened before in that area, and it was such a huge crime that normal people couldn't even begin to understand it. People. It was hard for prosecutors to build a strong case because a lot of the evidence was only weak. The things that were found in the cabin were very bad, but it was very hard to prove exactly what had happened to each victim. After heavy rains and being out in the elements, the burial site was in such bad shape that it was almost impossible to make a positive identification. With the medical knowledge he had at the time, Dr. Hicks did the best he could, but his conclusions had to be limited. What struck? What shocked everyone the most was how the brother acted during the trial. They sat next to each other and looked and sat the same way, watching the events with almost academic interest. They had no regret, no fear, and no other emotion that could be recognized. When they were asked to testify, they refused to say anything. They used their right to remain silent so strongly that not even their lawyers could get them to say anything. Thomas Wilkes was asked to be a witness. He had come from Kentucky, where he was living at the time, putting his life back together after Catherine died. He lost all color in his face when he walked into the courtroom and saw the brothers. He knew right away that they were the men who had hosted him and his wife that terrible night. His voice was shaking as he talked about the drink being offered, the confusion that followed, and waking up by himself. He looked right at the twins as he spoke, hoping to see some kind of response or recognition, but all he saw were those empty eyes staring at him without moving. Some other travelers were found and called in to testify. They had been through the area before and had some strange stories to share. One man said that he stopped at the cabin to ask for water, but felt an overwhelming need to leave right away, even though he was greeted warmly. Another person said that she saw the brothers in Newport and felt so uncomfortable around them that she turned around to avoid them. Even though these were fragmented stories and vague impressions, they painted a picture of two people. Men who made people naturally want to stay away from them. James Rutherford wrote about how he found the ravine, the smell that led him there, and how the horror that was hiding in the forest became clear over time. His voice was steady for most of his testimony, but it broke when he talked about one specific thing. A small Bible with the name of a traveling preacher written on the cover was among the things that were found. Rutherford had met this preacher briefly years before, but he had disappeared while traveling one day through the mountain ranges. Sheriff Crawford showed all the proof he had gathered. The things were taken out of the trunk in front of the jury. It was very important to carefully list each item and, if possible, connect it to a specific missing person. At least 17 different sets of belongings pointed to at least 17 victims, but Crawford thought the real number was probably higher. Some travelers didn't bring anything valuable with them, or had already gotten rid of their things in some other way. The defense said they thought the things that were taken could have been legally obtained, bought from travelers in need, or left behind on the trails. The case wasn't strong, and everyone in the room knew it. The amount, the variety, and the careful storage all pointed to a collection of trophies that was done on purpose. There was also the burial ground, the path that led directly to the brothers' property, and the tools that were found that had no real use. The brothers stayed surprisingly calm during the trial. They never talked to. There were whispers between their lawyers, but they never replied to what was said. It was like they were watching a show that had nothing to do with them. Men from the community who were on the jury had never seen anything like this before. It surprised them a lot. The prosecutor made a strong case to end his case. He talked about the lonely travelers who went through those mountains just to get to safety. He talked about friends and family who had no idea what happened to there, of years of pain and uncertainty for loved ones. He talked about the basic trust that people must have in each other, especially in remote areas where people need to help each other to stay alive. He also talked about how two men had thrown that trust into the wrong direction by seeing other people not as people, but as opportunities. It didn't take the jury more than 2 hours to decide. When they got back, everyone agreed on what they had found: guilty of killing several people. Nathaniel Pierce, the judge, was a strict man who was known for being fair. "Being sober," said the sentence in a serious tone. It was planned that both brothers would be hanged on December 15, 1911, 2 months after the trial ended. The brothers didn't say a word when they heard they were being put to death. There were no cries of outrage or regret, and there were no protests or pleas. They did what they were told, stood up, and let themselves be led back to prison. Then they disappeared from the courtroom, leaving everyone who saw them with unanswered questions and a deep chill. Over the next few weeks, reporters tried many times to talk to the prisoners. They were interested in what drove them, what their stories were, and what made them unique. The brothers turned down every request. They stayed in their own cells, ate the food that was given to them, and were completely silent. The guards who were watching said that they rarely spoke or moved around pointlessly, just existing like shadows, waiting for what was going to happen. The days before the execution were marked by a creepy environment in Newport and the nearby towns. It was like a dark cloud covered the whole area, a weight that everyone felt, even those who hadn't been paying close attention to the trial. On the streets, people spoke quietly. There seemed to be less business in the stores. At the same time, everyone felt like something fundamental had been upset, as if the land itself was waiting to see how this terrible story ended. There wasn't much to see at the county jail. It was just a red brick. A building with only 8 cells that is meant to house occasional drunks, small thieves, and people who cause trouble for a short time. People on death row for such serious crimes had never been held there before. Sheriff Crawford put guards on constant shifts, but it wasn't because he thought the brothers would try to get away. They hadn't shown any desire to do so, but he was afraid that an angry citizen would try to perform the execution themselves before it was officially done. This worry wasn't. Not true. After the trial, Thomas Wilkes couldn't leave the area without seeing the whole story through to the end. His walking through Newport was like that of a ghost. He drank too much and thought about Catherine to himself. He would sometimes show up near the prison at night and stare into the small cell windows. The guards had to gently but firmly lead him back to the boarding house where he was staying. But he was also deeply sad and angry at the same time. He was sure that not even the deaths of his brothers would. He would carry the wound from Catherine's death for the rest of his life, and she would never come back. In the days leading up to the execution, more family members of the victims started coming to town. When some people heard that their loved ones' belongings had been found, they came from a long way away and had been traveling for days. Harold Messner's sister Elizabeth was there. She was in her mid-40s and crying as she held on to her brother's watch, which still worked after all these years. The parents of one of the furriers were simple farmers who had saved money for months to make the trip to Tennessee. They had not known for 3 years whether their son was alive or dead, and they wanted to find closure. Each family had its own pain and story of hope that turned to despair over time. Some people spent their hard-earned money on private investigators whose searches turned up nothing. Others had patiently waited, thinking that news would come one day. They wouldn't accept the worst until they had no choice. Now, they were forced to live together in this small Tennessee town because they were all grieving and wanted to see justice done. Dr. Samuel Harris, who looked at the gravesite and testified at the trial, became very important to these families. He talked to them for hours, patiently telling them what he had found and answering their questions as honestly as he could without being mean. He hadn't chosen this role, but he felt very responsible for it. In every conversation, he was emotionally drained, but he kept going because he knew these people needed answers, even if they were only part of the answers and hurt them. At the same time, the brothers kept their scary silence inside the prison. Marcus Thorne, a kind reverend from the area, visited them many times, hoping to bring them spiritual comfort and maybe get them to confess or repent. His attempts had no effect at all. The brothers were polite to him and listened to his sermons without talking during them. Replied, never showed any signs of thinking about what he was saying. Thorne felt worse after each visit, like he had tried to reach for something that was fundamentally impossible. Young man named William Hayes, one of the guards, told Sheriff Crawford some disturbing things he had seen. He noticed that the brothers seemed to move in sync, even though they were locked up in different cells and couldn't talk to each other. As soon as one stood, the other would do the same. When one person ate, the other person started their meal. Almost at the same time. They went to sleep and woke up at the same time. It seemed like they had an invisible link, a shared awareness that went beyond their physical distance. Hayes admitted that it was probably just a coincidence or that he was overthinking things because he was under a lot of stress, but the event still upset him a lot. Crawford saw something strange too. Even though things were very bad for them, the brothers seemed very calm, almost serene. There was none of the usual hopelessness of jailed people, men waiting to be put to death. He had seen other prisoners go through stages of denial, anger, and bargaining over the course of his career, but this one didn't. They acted like death didn't mean anything to them, like it was just another change that didn't matter. They didn't seem to be accepting because they were brave or religious. Instead, it seemed like they didn't care about them at all, as if they had nothing to do with normal human experience. Newport began to fill up with people as December went on. Lots of different people. Some of them were related to the people who died. Others were just interested because the case was so well known. Journalists camped out in the city and sent daily reports to their papers. Street performers showed up and people set up booths with food and souvenirs. Something very uncomfortable about turning tragedy into a show had to happen, but it couldn't be stopped. At the time, public executions were common, and this case had caught the attention of. Groups mined in a way that not many other stories did. The judge who gave the sentence, Nathaniel Pierce, stayed in Newport during this time. He had a private meeting with Tennessee's governor to talk about whether there was any legal reason for review or clemency. They both agreed that there wasn't one. There was a lot of evidence. Everything about the trial was right, and the crimes were so bad that any mercy would be seen as wrong by the victims and their families. Pierce wasn't the kind of man he liked sending people to their deaths, but he was sure that this time it was the only thing that could be done. 3 days before the execution, something strange took place. The brother finally spoke up. Constable William Hayes brought them their dinner in the middle of the evening meal. With that deep, monotone voice, the brother looked right at Hayes and said, "The forest has always been hungry." Hayes got a chill from those 5 words. When he asked what that meant, his brother just came back and turned his attention to the food, ending the conversation just as quickly as it had begun. Hayes told Sheriff Crawford about what happened. Crawford carefully took notes, but those mysterious words didn't make sense to him. There were so many people in town the night before the execution that many had to camp outside in makeshift tents or just under the stars. Since it was December in the mountains, it was cold. That didn't stop anyone, though. Something strange was in the air, a mix of, people are naturally curious about things that happen right before they die, want justice, and feel like they are about to die. There were campfires all around the edges of town, and low voices talking made a murmur that didn't stop all night. Thomas Wilkes drank by himself in his boarding house room on that last night. He wrote Catherine's family a long letter in which he tried to explain how he felt, how sorry he was that he hadn't protected his wife, and how he hoped that the execution of those responsible would make things better, make things calm down. There were parts of the letter that didn't make sense because of tears and smeared ink, but he was still going to send it. That was all he could give. Poor words trying to fill a hole that can't be filled. Shirley Messner, Harold's sister, prayed for a long time that night. The talks she had with Reverend Thorne had helped her feel better, and now she was looking for strength to face what was to come. She wanted her brothers to be punished for their crimes and wanted to look them in the eyes as they were sentenced. Ware hung from the gallows. A different part of her just wanted to leave, go home, and try to forget everything, even though she knew she couldn't. She chose to stay in the end. Someone from her family should have been there to make sure her brother got justice. There was peace between the brothers as they slept in prison. At night, the guards watched their cells, maybe hoping to see them lose their cool, showing signs of fear at the thought of their own impending death. That didn't happen. They slept well and woke up early, and ate the breakfast that was given to them with a normal appetite. For some reason, it seemed like it was just another day, with no special meaning or weight. It was gray and heavy outside when Dorn got there on December 15, 1911. There were low clouds that made it look like snow might fall. It was piercing cold, the kind that gets through clothes and into the bones. Still, hundreds of people had been in Newport's Central Square since early in the morning, taking up all the space around the gallows that had been built just for the event. Just for this event. The building was simple but useful, and it was made by local carpenters following traditional plans. A horizontal beam was held up by 2 vertical beams and 2 ropes hanging next to each other. On the platform floor, there was a double trap door that was meant to open at the same time, letting both men fall at the same time. Robert Daniels, the experienced head carpenter, had tested the mechanism many times over the previous days to make sure it would work perfectly. He didn't like the work, but he knew it had to be done and did it with grim professionalism. Officer Crawford got to the jail early in the morning. He hadn't slept much because he was worried about the next day, but he thought what was going to happen would be fair. He didn't get any pleasure from it. As a police officer, he had seen a lot of bad things, but this case stood out. He looked over the ropes, the trapdoor mechanism, and every other part of the preparations by hand. There couldn't be any mistakes or extra time wasted on having pain. There was a level of civility that had to be kept up by even men like these brothers. The brothers were ready for what was going to happen inside their cells. Their clothes were changed into simple, clean ones that were made just for the event. They couldn't move because their hands were tied. During the whole process, they cooperated, kept quiet, and moved when told, so the guards could do their job without any problems. William Hayes, who helped get things ready, said later that it was like putting clothes on dolls. There was no response from people. There was only passive acceptance. Reverend Thorne tried one more time. He went into one of the brothers' cells first, then the other, and said his last prayers and gave them a chance to confess. He read from his Bible, which was shaking a little, not because it was cold, but because of something deeper. He talked about redemption and God's forgiveness. The brothers just listened and looked through him instead of at him. Thorne asked them if they had anything to say. Say that if they wanted to say sorry or ask for forgiveness, there was no answer. There was only that blank stare, those clear eyes that showed nothing but an incomprehensible void. The cell doors opened at 9 o'clock in the morning. They were led outside and stood next to each other for the first time in weeks. Guards put them next to each other in the narrow hallway, and there was a brief pause. While the twins looked at each other briefly, they said something to each other that no one else could hear. I get it. It wasn't a goodbye or emotional recognition look. It was something else, like they were confirming something they had already agreed on, or sharing something secret. It took less than 200 yards to walk from the jail to the square. The brothers, who were accompanied by 4 armed guards, came next, followed by Reverend Thorne, who recited psalms in a low voice, and finally official witnesses like Judge Pierce and state government officials. The crowd that had gathered along the path was very quiet. There were no yells or insults, which can happen during executions. People just stood there and watched, their faces showing a range of emotions, from grim satisfaction to barely concealed horror. It was easy for Thomas Wilk to see the gallows from where he stood in the crowd. His eyes were red from not getting enough sleep and drinking, and his face was pale. He yelled Catherine's name as the brothers walked by, and his voice broke with sadness. The brothers did not do anything, didn't look at him, and kept walking with that unsettling calm. Thomas broke down in tears and fell to his knees in the street. People helped him up, but their words of comfort were not enough to ease his unbearable grief. Elizabeth Messner stood further back in the crowd with Dr. Hurricks, who had offered to stay with her through the whole thing. She held on tight to a handkerchief and moved her lips in a silent prayer. She felt bad when she saw the men who had taken her brother away. A wave of feelings that don't match up. Yes, there was anger and a need for justice to be done, but she was also very sad not for the people who were being sentenced, but for the world that made people like them and for the unimaginable loss her family had suffered. The brothers took slow, steady steps up the steps to the gallows. They didn't think twice, and they didn't need to be dragged or pushed like some bad men did. They just climbed up, put their feet on the marked trap doors, and held still while their legs were tied. The executioner did a good job. He was hired specifically for the job and flown in from Nashville. He adjusted the ropes around the men's necks, double-checked the measurements, and made sure everything was set up correctly to make sure they died quickly. Sheriff Crawford got on the platform and, as the law required, asked the condemned men in a formal way if they had any last words. It was very quiet for a long time. Everyone in the crowd held their breath. Then one of the brothers spoke, and his deep voice could be heard clearly across the empty square. "We just go where the forest tells us to go. It has always needed gifts. There will be more after us. It's always hungry." The crowd felt like they were hit with stones thrown into still water. The words caused waves of discomfort and confusion. Neither was it a legal confession, nor a confession of sin, or a request for forgiveness. It was a strange, cryptic statement that hinted at a crazy set of beliefs, or a justification for delusions, for what he did. The other brother didn't say anything, but there was a small smile on his face, as if he and his twin were sharing a secret joke that only they both knew. Crawford did not ask for more information. He just gave the executioner a nod, and the man put a black hood over each person's head, hiding their faces for good. Reverend Thorne said one last prayer, and his voice was shaking but steady as he asked God to have mercy on the souls that were about to leave. The crowd stayed completely. Be quiet. Even the kids that were there seemed to understand how serious and important the event was. The killer moved to the lever that opened and closed the trap doors. There was one last pause, one last moment when time seemed to stop and nothing moved. After hearing the metallic sound of the lever being pulled and the crash of the trapdoors opening, two bodies fell through empty space at the same time. The square was filled with the terrible finality of the sound of ropes suddenly getting tighter. The bodies moved for a while. Moments, uncontrollable movements that got softer and softer until they stopped completely. As part of his job, Dr. Hicks waited the right amount of time before getting on the platform to check their vital signs. He put his stethoscope against both men's chests and checked their pulses. Then he nodded to show that they had both died. Technically, the execution had been perfect. The person died instantly, as planned, and did not have to suffer for a long time. The crowd was quiet for a while, minutes after the official news came out. There were no cheers or applause. Everything was very quiet, almost as if people were trying to process what they had just seen. Some people slowly spread out, while others stood still, as if they were stuck there. What was going on at that moment was more important than just the end of a legal case. It felt like a bigger event had just happened, but no one could say what it was. When it was all over, Thomas Wilkes broke down in tears. He thought he would feel better, maybe like the story was over, but all he felt was emptiness. Even though the men who killed Catherine were dead, she wasn't brought back to life. Asked him a lot of questions that made him feel bad, and didn't heal the wound that had been bleeding inside him since that terrible night. His friends had to practically carry him back to the boarding house, where he would stay locked in his room for 3 days before he finally got the strength to leave. Start the long trip back to Kentucky. While Elizabeth Messner cried in silence, Dr. Hendricks stood next to her and put a firm hand on her shoulder, offering her support. She thought that seeing justice done would bring some kind of peace. But now she saw that peace might not be possible. Harold, her brother, was still dead and had been brutally taken away from her life years before. It was necessary and right to put his killers to death. But that didn't change the past or make up for what happened. The space he left empty. The bodies were left hanging for the legally required amount of time, which made sure that death was final and could not be undone. After that, they were lowered and made ready to be buried. No one came forward to claim the body parts. They were not claimed by any family. The Reverend Thorne set up a simple burial in a faraway part of the local cemetery, away from the graves of good people. Simple stones and numbers were all that were on the graves. There were no names or dates other than the year. It was as if even in death, the brothers stayed unknown and were tried to be forgotten as much as possible. In the days after the brother was put to death, reporters from major newspapers started to look into his past more. They combed records in multiple states, sent telegrams to sheriffs in dozens of counties, and spoke to anyone who might have information. What they discovered was fragmentary and inconclusive, but still disturbing. There was evidence that the brothers had lived in at least 3 different states before settling. In Tennessee. In each location, their stay had coincided with unexplained disappearances of travelers. In Kentucky, 2 men matching the twins' description were recorded as having operated a small inn near the Wilderness Trail for approximately 2 years, between 1893 and 1895. During that period, at least 5 people disappeared after being seen traveling along that route. Local authorities had never connected the disappearances to the inn, and when the owners simply left one day, taking all their belongings with them, no one thought much of it. In West Virginia, there were even older reports dating back to 1890. 2 twin brothers had worked temporarily at a logging operation in the mountains, a job that kept them isolated for long periods. Workers at the logging operation at the time commented on their strange behavior, how they seemed to avoid social interaction, how they would disappear for entire days without explanation. When the logging operation closed and all the workers dispersed, the twins simply vanished, and only. Later, did some locals begin to connect their presence with the disappearance of a hiker who had been seen in the area. These findings raised disturbing questions. If the brothers had indeed been involved in similar crimes in other states over nearly a decade, how many victims were there? The number of 17, suggested by the Tennessee evidence, could be only a fraction of the true total, but without thorough investigations in these other locations, without preserved physical evidence, it was impossible to know for sure. The crimes of the past would remain mysteries. The victims would remain unidentified. Their families would never know what happened. Sheriff Crawford spent weeks after the execution working with authorities in other states, sharing information, trying to build a more complete picture. He personally traveled to Kentucky, spoke with the local sheriff, and pored over old records. What he found was discouraging. Cold leads, faded memories, evidence long lost or destroyed. The best he could do was establish a probable timeline of the brothers' movements over the years, a trail of suspicions and disappearances that stretched across the Appalachians like a dark scar. Meanwhile, the brothers' Tennessee property became an object of morbid curiosity. People began visiting, seeking souvenirs or simply to see the site where such horrors had occurred. Sheriff Crawford eventually ordered the cabin burned, eliminating this focal point of sick fascination. The fire consumed the structure quickly, the dry timbers burning intensely and reducing everything to ash within hours. Even afterward, however, people continued to visit the site, walking through the empty valley, trying to understand how such evil had flourished there undetected for so long. The burial site, discovered by James Rutherford, was treated with greater reverence. Dr. Herricks oversaw a careful and appropriate exhumation. The remains found were treated with dignity, prepared for proper burial. With most of them unclearly identified, a mass memorial was created in Newport Cemetery. A simple but elegant stone was erected, inscribed with the words, "In memory of the unknown travelers who perished in the mountains. May they rest in peace and not be forgotten." Families who had lost loved ones and never found them visited this memorial, leaving flowers, praying, seeking some form of connection with those they loved. Thomas Wilkes never returned to Tennessee after his departure. He sold his Kentucky estate a few years later and moved west, trying to leave behind the memories that haunted him. Occasional correspondence with acquaintances suggest he never found true peace. He never remarried, lived alone on a small farm in Kansas, and died in 1916 at the age of 48. Some who knew him in the last years of his life commented that he often spoke to someone who was not there, murmuring the name Catherine in quiet moments. Elizabeth Messner dedicated the rest of her life to helping families of missing persons. She used part of the small inheritance left by Harold to establish a fund that assisted with searches and investigations. She worked with authorities in multiple states, pushing for better record-keeping and coordination between jurisdictions. Her work was pioneering in some ways, anticipating more organized systems that would emerge decades later. She died in 1923, respected in her community as someone who had transformed personal tragedy into service to others. Reverend Marcus Thorne could never completely forget those days. The prison visits, the condemned men's enigmatic last words, the execution he witnessed, all of it stayed with him. He occasionally incorporated reflections on that experience into his sermons, speaking about the nature of evil, how we sometimes encounter things that defy easy comprehension, and the importance of remaining vigilant against the darkness that can lurk in secluded places. People in his church paid close attention when he talked about these things because they knew he was speaking from personal experience with something very upsetting. In the months after the execution, there was a slow but steady. The Appalachian area of East Tennessee has changed in a way that can be seen. It seemed like taking away the twin brothers broke some kind of dark spell that was over those mountains. There was less fear on the trails as time went on, but the crimes of the past were never forgotten. Traders who had avoided certain routes in the past started using them again, and slowly things got back to normal, but the scars could still be seen. But there. After that case, Sheriff Benjamin Crawford was a different person. Look at that. He was once not well known outside of his own county, but now people all over Tennessee and beyond knew him as the police officer who put an end to one of the scariest criminal operations in recent Appalachian history. Newspapers in Nashville, Chattanooga, and even Louisville and Atlanta wrote about him and praised how hard he worked and how brave he was. But Crawford wasn't trying to get noticed. He seemed to be uncomfortable with all the attention, and he would rather be working on his day job, making sure that his county is safe. In private talks with close friends, Crawford said that the case had had a big impact on him. During his time as sheriff, he saw a lot. He knew how to handle murders, robberies with violence, and all other kinds of crimes that people do to each other. But there was something different about these brothers that made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just the severity of their crimes or how cruel they were. It was also the complete lack of any recognizable feelings in people. When you looked into an abyss and saw that the abyss was looking back, you didn't understand or recognize each other. For the rest of his life, Dr. Samuel Hendress also felt the effects of that event. As a doctor, he had studied the human body, treated all kinds of injuries and illnesses, and been there when people were born and died. But looking at that gravesite, making a list of the evidence, testifying at the trial, and being there at the execution all at the same time, made an indelible mark on his mind. He started writing down a lot of information about the case, not because he planned to publish it, but because it helped him work through his own feelings and experiences. These notes, which were found many years after he had died in 1937, showed interesting things about how he thought about the case from a medical and philosophical point of view. Hari made guesses about the brothers' personality, wondering if there was something fundamentally different about the way they thought or felt. His tools and knowledge were not up to date. Psychiatry to make a formal diagnosis, but what he saw was incredibly insightful. He said that the brothers seemed to be outside the normal range of human experience, as if they were watching people rather than being a part of it. One very telling part of his notes said, "I looked into those men's eyes many times during the trial and afterward. I looked for something recognizable, some sign of the spark we think makes people human. I found nothing. It was like looking into a well. They made masks that looked perfect on the outside but were empty on the inside. They behaved like humans but didn't feel it. They ate, slept, and breathed, but without the emotional context that gives these actions meaning. They died with the same lack of care that they lived with, as if life and death didn't matter to them." James Rutherford, the hunter who made the first discovery, became a controversial figure in his own community. Some saw him as a hero because he finally exposed the creatures. Others avoided him as if he had a bad reputation from the horrible place he had found. James dealt with this by slowly pulling away from people. He kept hunting, but now he liked to do it by himself and avoided even the occasional company he had once enjoyed. He stopped hunting in some parts of the forest, especially near the old valley where his brother's cabin had stood. When asked why, he just said those areas were no longer safe. There was some truth to this. Other hunters confirmed that the animals in the area seemed to have changed their habits and avoided that valley even years after the cabin burned down. It was as if the animals could sense something was wrong, and that the land had been tainted in a way that humans couldn't understand. The brothers' last words before they were put to death were the subject of heavy debate and speculation. People whispered these phrases under their breath while trying to figure out what they meant. Some said they were just delusions, last-ditch attempts to make up a story that would excuse crimes that weren't justified. Others said they showed a skewed set of beliefs, possibly based on old superstitions or wrong understandings of religious practices. Reverend Thorne preached several sermons that looked at these issues from a theological point of view. He talked about the nature of evil and how people can get so lost in the dark that they start to make up whole reasons for doing bad things. He warned his congregation about the dangers of spiritual and physical isolation, saying that people need community and moral connection to stay human. His sermons were powerful and moving, often making people cry. But there was another part to those last words that few people talked about it openly, but many thought about it in silence. The idea that others would follow was very scary. Was it just a threat, a last-ditch effort to make people afraid, or was there something darker going on? Sheriff Crawford took those words seriously enough to increase surveillance on the main trails through his county for years to come. He also kept in touch with sheriffs in neighboring counties and shared information about any suspicious activity. Luckily, nothing similar happened. Over the next few years, a pattern of disappearances began to show up in the area. Traveling through the Appalachians was still dangerous because of the weather, and accidents did happen from time to time, but there was no proof of organized predation like the one the brothers had done. However, the idea of it still lingered in people's minds. Parents warned their kids about the risks of staying with strangers in remote areas, and travelers became more careful and aware of signs of danger. The cabin was abandoned, and the legal owner, a faraway speculator who had bought large tracts of land in the Appalachians years before, tried to sell it but couldn't find anyone interested. No matter how low the price, no one wanted that valley. Eventually, the land was given back to the state for not paying taxes, and it became public land. The forest slowly took back the space where the cabin had been, with new trees growing through the stumps. After many years, when state parks and national forests started to appear in the Appalachians, that valley was marked on official maps but never developed. Rangers who patrolled the area said it had an eerie feeling, but most thought it was just their knowledge of the area's history making them believe it. Despite this, no official trails were built through that valley and no campgrounds were set up near it. It was as if there had been an unspoken agreement to leave that place alone and let nature keep it hidden and forgotten. The families of the people who were killed had different ways of dealing with their grief. Some members of the Messna family became advocates for solo travelers, setting up safe rest stops along major routes where people could rest without fear. Others made private memorials, small monuments in family cemeteries to honor the dead. Still others just tried to move on, burying their grief deeply and rarely talking about what had happened. Before leaving Tennessee for good, Thomas Wilkes made one last visit to the mass memorial in Newport Cemetery. He sat on the wet grass next to the memorial stone for hours and spoke softly, as if Catherine could hear him. He told her about the years that had passed since his death and how he had tried to keep living but never really succeeded. He apologized for not protecting her, for being so easily knocked out that terrible night, and for waking up to find her missing without doing more to find her. People who saw him there said it was heartbreaking to see a broken man talking to a stone with tears running down his face, and a voice that would sometimes rise in pain and then fall back into inaudible murmurs. When he finally got up to leave, he put his hand on the cold stone and stood there for a long time, then turned and walked away without looking back. People who knew him said something about him changed after that visit, as if he had finally accepted something he had been avoiding for years. As the years went by, the story of the Appalachian twin brothers slowly turned from a living memory to a local legend. The people who had seen the execution got older, told their stories to their children and grandchildren, and then died, leaving behind details that would never be written down in an official document. The case stayed in the county archives, where dusty boxes held testimonies, evidence, and letters between officials waiting for some future. The cemetery where the brothers were buried has been fixed up several times over the years. Some old graves were preserved, others were fixed up, and others were just left to fall apart naturally over time. The simple stones that mark the graves of the twins stayed mostly hidden, partly hidden by weeds, and rarely visited by anyone. There were no flowers or whispered prayers there, just silence and deliberate oblivion. It was as if the community had collectively forgotten about them. People wanted to forget about those men as much as possible, but stories have lives of their own, especially dark and disturbing ones. The case has been found again and again by different generations. In the 1920s, a Nashville journalist wrote a series of in-depth articles on historic Tennessee crimes, dedicating 3 full issues to the twin brothers. In the 1940s, a college student chose the case as the subject of his thesis on Appalachian crime, spending months in the county archives and interviewing witnesses. In the 1960s, when TV first came out, a documentary filmmaker tried to make a show about the case. The project was never finished because it was hard to find video footage from the time, but each rediscovery brought new ideas and perspectives. Modern psychologists reading about the brothers' behavior made guesses about what might have been wrong with them. Some thought they might have had some kind of shared psychopathy, a mental illness that affects many people at once. A rare condition causes twins to develop similar psychological patterns of not caring about others and acting badly toward others. Others said that their extreme loneliness and possible childhood abuse or trauma could have messed up their emotional development. But these were all guesses based on the past. The full truth of who they were and what made them who they were stayed buried with them in that forgotten corner of the cemetery. The memorial for the unknown victims, on the other hand, became a place of silent pilgrimage. Over the years, many people with their own stories of loss have visited the site. Families who had lost loved ones in mysterious circumstances, even if they had nothing to do with the brothers' case, found comfort there. It was as if that simple stone had become a symbol for all those who disappeared into the wild mountains, whose stories would never be fully told, and whose fates would never be known. Newport has changed a lot over the years. It used to be a small, isolated mountain town, but it has grown and become more modern. Roads were paved, electricity came, and then phones, TVS, and the internet. The world shrunk, and the isolation that used to be common in the area became much less severe. Trips that took days in the early 1900s could be finished in hours. Modern technology and infrastructure have made traveling alone much less dangerous. But even with all this progress, the forest stayed. There were still millions of acres of wilderness in the Appalachians that made it easy for someone to get lost or go missing. And every once in a while, stories came out about a hiker who didn't come back from the trailhead, a camper who disappeared overnight, or a traveler whose last known location was on a remote back road. Most of these cases had simple explanations, like accidents, disorientation, or medical conditions, but some were still mysteries. And when they did, people always thought of There's an old story about twin brothers who died and said their last words were about never-ending famines. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford worked as a deputy until he retired at age 65 in 1923. He lived another 10 years and died peacefully in 1933. At his funeral, many people spoke about how the twin brothers' case showed what kind of career and person he was. His successor, a younger man named Daniel Foster, took over both the job and the responsibility of keeping it running. Foster was responsible for keeping an eye on the county's trails and routes. He did this by setting up regular patrols, staying in touch with game wardens and authorities in neighboring counties, and thoroughly investigating any reports of strange activity in remote areas. During his time as sheriff, which ended in the 1950s, there were no cases similar to the ones involving the twin brothers. He thought this was his biggest accomplishment, even though he knew that a lot of it was just luck. Bigger changes in society made it harder for criminals to get away with their crimes. Dr. Samuel Hriss, whose private notes were so helpful, was buried in the same cemetery as the memorial to the victims and the graves of the criminals. His grave was in a newer section of the cemetery, away from both, and it looked out over the mountains he had loved all his life. On the headstone, he chose a simple quote to put next to his name and dates of death. It was a fitting epitaph for a man who had looked so deeply into both the light and the dark sides of human nature. James Rutherford lived until 1948, when he died at the age of 72. In his later years, he finally started to talk more openly about what he had found that September day in 1911. He told his grandson, who loved adventure stories, how he had followed that strange smell, what he had found, and how that moment had changed his life. It changed the rest of his life. His grandson, who would later become a local historian, kept these stories alive and eventually published them as part of a larger collection on the history of county. Elizabeth Messner left a lasting legacy by working to help the families of missing persons. The fund she started continued to run for decades after she died and eventually merged with larger organizations that were also working to find missing people and help their families. In historical records, her name shows up not only as the sister of a victim, but also as a leader in a field that would become more important as better ways of tracking and investigating disappearances were developed. Thomas Wilkes was a tragic figure until the end. His letters, which were kept by distant relatives and eventually given to a historical archive, showed a man who was tormented by guilt and loss. He never stopped wondering if there was something else he could have done that night. There were clues he should have seen if Catherine had been in pain and thought of him in her last moments. He never got answers to these questions, and they weighed on him until the day he died. His story is a sad reminder that victims of violent crimes are not just those who die, but also those who live with invisible wounds for the rest of their lives. Reverend Marcus Thorne continued to serve as a pastor in Newport until he retired in 1930. He was replaced by younger pastors, but his influence in. The community stayed strong because of his sermons on the nature of evil, the need for moral vigilance, and how communities should care for their weakest members. These ideas stuck with people long after he stopped preaching. The church he served kept records of his most important sermons, and ministers today still quote them when talking about morality and community ethics. The valley where the brothers' cabin used to be is still not very popular. Hikers with GPS and cell phones sometimes pass by, but they don't know much about the area's history. The forest has taken over the space, and nothing can be seen to show that buildings were ever there. But there are people who know the history, local guides and historians who can point in the right direction and give sped-up versions of what happened more than 100 years ago. And there are still reports never confirmed but persistent that the valley still has a strange vibe. People who camp near the valley say they have scary dreams, feel like they are being watched, and are restless for no reason, which makes them leave earlier than planned. Skeptics say this is just the power of suggestion, or that knowing about the past changes how people feel. But people who have had these experiences say there is something real about them that can't be explained. As with most ancient stories, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The valley is just a valley. Trees and rocks. It's just rocks and earth like any other mountain spot. But it has history, and history has weight. Knowing what happened there, even unconsciously, changes how people experience that space. You don't have to believe in ghosts to understand that places where terrible things happened can carry a kind of memory that isn't supernatural but deeply human, woven into the stories we tell and retell. The case of the Appalachian twin brothers is still a story that both fascinates and disturbs people today. This is both a story about how vulnerable people are and how travelers who trusted strangers' kindness were betrayed in the worst way possible. It's also a story about evil that is hard to understand and people who don't seem to follow normal rules of morality and empathy. In the end, justice was done, but it was too late to save those who had already been lost. But it's also a story about how communities came together to face the horrors in their midst. About families who used their grief to create legacies that helped others even though they couldn't save their own loved ones. About police who persisted through difficult investigations in an era when resources were limited and technology was basic. About regular people who showed extraordinary bravery in situations that tested their emotional strength. The Appalachians are still beautiful and dangerous, welcoming and threatening, just like they were in 1901. Every year, millions of people visit these mountains, hiking their trails, camping in their forests, and taking in the breathtaking views. Most of the time, these visits are safe and end with nothing but happy memories and beautiful photos. But every once in a while, someone doesn't come back. And when that happens, when searches are held and mysteries remain unsolved, people always think of the old stories. They remember that these ancient mountains hold secrets, and that not everything that happens in them is what it seems. These stories don't make us afraid. They keep us alert and remind us that evil does exist, even if it's rare. Vulnerable people need to be protected. Communities need to stay alert. And those who died, and whose stories were violently cut short, should be remembered not just as victims, but as people who lived, loved, and traveled with hope in their hearts before meeting deaths they never deserved. People still visit the memorial in Newport every once in a while. Flowers are still left there, especially on certain anniversaries. And on cold winter nights, when the wind blows through the Appalachians carrying the smell of pines and damp earth, people still gather around fireplaces and tell stories. Some stories are about adventure and beauty, others about mystery and danger, and this one is about both. It reminds us that the world is full of different things, that light and dark exist together, and that we need to be aware of both as we go through it. If this story touched you in any way, if learning about these events in the past and thinking about what they mean for us now, please consider subscribing to this channel. We will continue to explore disturbing and fascinating stories from history, cases that didn't fit with their time, but still have an impact on us now. Each subscription helps us bring more of these stories to light, keeping memories alive that could be easily forgotten. And if you have a moment, tell us what you think about this. Please let us know if you have any other historical cases you'd like us to look into, or if you like this story. Your like also helps other people who are interested in true history find it. Thank you for going on this dark journey with us through Appalachian history. Until the next story.